Good morning, everyone. I think some of you are unfortunately going to get two lots of me in less than 24 hours, so I'm sorry for that. But so I'm Tom. I'm the CEO of Immerse. So we are an enterprise VR business that's focused on training and assessment. We're based out of the UK, soon to be setting up an office here in Houston. We're very proud to be sitting on the same stage as Shell, one of our favorite clients, and I'm very pleased to be running this session with James, who's been a big supporter of ours. So James, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, no, happy to. So yeah, James Johnson, I'm working the Learning and Organisation Development department in Shell, part of our HR function, where I've spent for about 13 years in various roles. So across upstream, and I'm sure for in Houston, there's probably some people who have a pretty good understanding. I work in the upstream part of the business, so that's kind of our exploration through development, through operating offshore, Gulf of Mexico, Brazil, Nigeria, Malaysia. I'm based here, although I sound like I'm from London, where Tom is from. And so our Deepwater business, which is the one I support, has a footprint of probably, I think it's around 8 assets in the Gulf of Mexico at the moment. We have 300 plus employees working offshore in highly operational, safety critical roles. And we have a kind of a training center in Louisiana, in a place called Robert, Louisiana, which I'd be surprised if many people know where that is, but north shore of the lake there. So and a very proud history of having highly competent people working in our organization. So I guess what we want to talk about here and the perspective I will give is kind of how we're trying to maintain and deepen the expertise and knowledge that we have in our workforce, particularly in the context of a lot of the experienced people who worked through the industry through the 70s and 80s. A lot of those people are leaving the organization now or have left the organization. So we need to think of different ways of training people up, again, in a much more cost competitive environment. So there's some of the kind of external factors that play into why we arrived at looking at virtual reality and other technologies to deliver training in a more effective and efficient way. So that's kind of perspective I'll bring, and hopefully Tom will be able to bring a bit more of the sort of technical savviness, because I'm really not on the technology side. I'm more on the application of it rather than the
You're very modest, James. You're very modest. So why don't we just sort of kick it off with, really, why are we on the stage together? So how come?
Do we have the clicker?
Yeah. Is there a clicker?
Is it up here?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Technology.
And the clock's not running either, so I don't want to be drifting into the third hour with everyone falling asleep. So, you've got the better beard than I have. That's all I can say. Let's kind of go into that sort of reason for why we're sitting on the stage. I mean, I think that's really interesting for people to hear. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of really great, innovative VR, AR businesses here. We can we have a sense of why VR, and we're obviously very passionate about it. But VR was relatively new for you when you came into contact with us. So perhaps give a bit of background there would be great.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to keep things at a high level. I heard the conversation previously where the Bechtel guys were talking about some of this stuff as well and had some good examples. I mean, what does this mean for us in the Gulf of Mexico? So for me, one of the big things here is around reducing our risk of training. So or the safety risk associated with training. So one of the most dangerous things we do outside of an operational environment is strap people into a helicopter, drop them into a swimming pool, tip it upside down, and then ask them to get out. And that's office-based people, that's people who work offshore. That's basically putting people deliberately in a very high-risk situation so that they get training, so they get kind of muscle memory, so they know process to follow in the event that happens in real life. And I mean, maybe I'll go around some booths. We're not going to be able to replicate being underwater in a virtual environment, I don't think, at this point. But there's a lot of stuff we do around process, safety, behavioral safety that we wanted to try and put people in pretty hazardous situations, but with minimal risk. And that, for me, was one of the big selling points that when we're talking to the business stakeholders who we need to work with, so our VP for the Gulf of Mexico business, all the asset managers, if you can tell, look, I can train your people even more effectively and there's going to be zero risk to that, that was a big selling point. The effectiveness point is linked to that. So fortunately, over time, we have less abnormal incidents. So we have less pumps, compressors going down, or even kind of more kind of catastrophic events. And if you combine that with the workforce being more inexperienced, people haven't had the opportunity to put themselves in kind of harm's way or have to start up a unit from scratch when you weren't expecting it. So we can replicate real-life situations in a very realistic way. Again, people are going to get much more effective learning from that. I think from a cost point of view as well, which is maybe more specific to us or people who have trainees or the people who need that learning in remote locations, it's pretty expensive to fly a helicopter offshore to go and either send someone out to do some training or to be bringing people back on shore to deliver training outside of their shift time. You incur things, overtime. You're basically eating into people's downtime when they're supposed to, they're working for 2 weeks, they're supposed to have 2 weeks off. So if we can reduce the cost from a financial point of view, that we can deliver training actually where people are working in the flow of their training or in the flow of their work, which is a sort of a new way we're looking at it, that has a significant kind of cost benefit for us. You then don't need to have people traveling to training, putting them up in hotels like this, and paying overtime. So that's a kind of a key thing. The area that we've done less on, and maybe Tom, you could talk a bit more, is around the measurement. So really we've been focused on trying to get the frontline benefits bought into by our business leaders. But I think there's some peripheral things, kind of secondary or tertiary, that once we have more training done in a controlled environment, where we can gather data, I do think there's something on measurement, and that's the area which we probably need to explore further in the coming years.
I think that's right. I think when we start the selling journey, if you like, and we're selling into you at the beginning, it's very easy to sell on the experience because VR sells itself. It's very rare that anyone will ever go in a headset and come out and say, no, I'm just going to stay in the classroom. Everyone kind of gets it at that level, at an excitement level. But I think trying to make the case around measurement at that very first stage is very hard because there's not a great deal of efficacy data out there. There just isn't. Very few companies that are using VR are publishing any results. So I think in that why phase, there is a very heavy reliance, certainly talking from the position of the vendor, in that kind of experience and really trying to hope that the people you've got opposite you get it and are curious. And I think that's always certainly a challenge from our side as Immerse, relatively unknown, small, based in London. We're always looking for the curious people within the organization, the people that say maybe there is a better blend, maybe there's a better way of just relying on classroom and e-learning and then one piece of on-the-job training. And generally speaking, those people are very hard to find. They're not all on one website. And there's a lot of digging often required to get to those people. Quite a lot of them in this room. So I think that's, and that measurement piece, if I'd have come to you and overwhelmed you with data, you would have probably sort of turned away. So yeah, certainly from our side, that kind of measurement piece typically starts to come in further down the line. That's what I would say. Okay. So kind of moving on a little bit from that kind of initial piece and why you came to those sort of decisions and some of those factors that you were looking for. I think clearly there's a lot of people in the room are interested in that kind of the what element. So what was it that you were really looking for when you were making these decisions about VR and choosing partners?
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean I could talk a bit about what we want the outcome to be, and there probably won't be many surprises there. But I think one of the things that we learn, and again, you referenced, there's the DTS guys, there's Kinetic Magic, I think, here as well as you guys. We want to work with vendors on this who can come in at an early stage. So we don't have the answers on this. I said to you guys earlier that I'm really not a technical guy. I have people in my team who are deep learning experts. They really understand different ways of learning, and they really understand the business in which we operate. The technology side of things is a pillar to their kind of skill set, my skill set that we're less knowledgeable on. So there's also a bit of recognition, as Tom says, there's lots of people out there, very big companies. Again, some of you guys might, the Accentures of this world, and smaller companies as well. So we have always enjoyed, particularly my team in Louisiana, working with vendors who we know the people. It's the same people who keep turning up. We can build that knowledge, that trust and relationship with them, because this is entering onto a journey which, 18 months ago we really didn't know where we were going to go. So that relationship element is particularly important for us. So again, that's why we working with Tom and a bunch of other what we call kind of strategic and tactical vendors who can kind of co-create and co-shape where we're trying to go. So that's been pretty helpful. I think an area that we identified pretty early on in this process, more on the kind of e-learning, computer-based training, was if the content of what we're training is largely operational, technical engineering, having businesses or organizations that have some of that expertise there, so that we're not having to explain, a valve is this big, it's not huge, it's not like turning on your tap. So just some very practical things. I think co-location helps, which is somewhat ironic given that the Immerse guys were in London and my team are in Louisiana. But through some dedicated kind of face-to-face sessions at the beginning and at key points throughout the project, that's really helped as well. Obviously, if you could all be in the same room, that would be great, but it seems a bit counterintuitive. Talk about a virtual reality technology-based project and we want everyone together, but I do think there's some value in that. The other thing which, for those of you who work in any kind of matrix organization where there's different silos, different countries, the thing which has been the biggest pain that I've had to manage, and we're still managing through, is how do you integrate a solution that we come up with in one part of our business with everything that's going on elsewhere? And that can be from a platform point of view. So we have these kind of cards, GID cards, they call you, plug it in your computer and it's kind of got all your passwords come up and it gives you access to all the shell-approved tools. But the shell-approved tools are all held by a central group, normally in the Netherlands. So we would ideally have one platform that you could go in, all your VR content, whether it's to do with operations training, whether it's to do with leadership training, commercial, is in one place. And managing that and trying to herd our organization, not just on the learning side, but the IT side, to buy into that has been a challenge. And that's not because people have bad behaviors, it's just that everyone's jumping on technology and VR for multiple different uses. So that's been a big challenge, but a success criteria will be that we have this training that we deliver here, you've got a little picture of it, and we've got some more pictures later on. That's all around safety activity, so safety critical activities. So basically keeping hydrocarbons in the pipe, all the way from exploration through to point of sale to a vendor or a third party. And that's the same whether you're in the Gulf of Mexico, whether you're in a manufacturing site on the Gulf Coast, but we still have multiple different ways of training for that. So this has been a kind of standardization process at the same time. And we're by no means there, but at least we can start to demonstrate here an end-to-end solution from how someone accesses training, how their data is stored, how it's kept in a secure and safe way, and that the quality of that training is consistently high. There's a couple of other things on the slide here which are kind of standard things. It needs to add value versus the current process. It needs to be affordable, and again, I think we've seen that over the past couple of years. The cost on these things is coming down, which helps. But yeah, I think that the integration piece and being able to integrate with existing systems and a vendor who can come in at kind of when we've got ideas not even 50% formed and really co-create that with us has been two of the kind of key things which I think have made this and other projects we're doing successful.
Okay, but I think, I mean, if you look at your decision criteria, I mean, there are a lot of things that you're weighing up that we, as the solution provider, don't necessarily have the answer for. So we don't make the hardware. The hardware landscape is evolving. You know, we've seen a big shift over the course of this year in terms of moving to these more mobile devices. And I think, certainly from a vendor perspective, it explains why the sales cycle can be extremely long, because there are a lot of factors that you're weighing up. You may be sold on some of these elements, but actually some of these other pieces, the hardware elements, particularly the integration with your systems, with your single sign-on, those kinds of things, it's very difficult to prove those at the beginning. You know, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's worked well, is that you've got to a point where you've had to take a leap of faith. You've had to say, well, look, they haven't got all the answers, but they're doing a lot of the key things right, I think. And that, you know, certainly from our experience, that is not always the case. And I think people are, you know, large companies particularly are, you know, can tend to put off those decisions, or have an affinity with the bigger partner with whom they feel more secure. There's maybe a long-term relationship, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's worked well, is that there was some trust established quite early on. I think. Do you think that's fair?
I think, yeah, and I especially think in this phase of things where it's not like, we take e-learning, for example. We have a partner there offshore. They can deliver that at scale, and there's very little, you know, you don't need to do a lot of the upfront thinking on how is this going to work, how is this going to get integrated. So I think there's a maturity of the technology evolves. I think that has the potential to evolve as well. But this was completely immature in Shell. We will come to some of the pilots that we were doing, very standalone, and how we're trying to move that through the funnel to having this be a way of working in Shell, and way of developing new content for our kind of training and assurance needs.
Yeah, and I think because you're dealing with a number of different parts of Shell, so you're dealing with people, for example, in instructional design, who are very new to the use of VR, you know, as a potential solution. You know, as we all know, there's no manual on instructional design for VR. You know, there will be some best practices emerging. As we were hearing a bit from Kyle yesterday, people will be more ready to share, but I think instinctively people are kind of worried about making the wrong decision with something that isn't fundamentally broke. And I think that's what makes things, you know, can put a bit of extra time into that process at this early stage.
Yeah, and ultimately the recipients of the benefit or the failure of this are our business leaders. So having the right business leader who buys into this and sees the transformative potential it could offer, I think that also helps. So we've had pull in certain areas. I mentioned the Gulf of Mexico is where we focus. With Brazil, Nigeria, Malaysia, they're equally important countries, and potentially on paper, some of these things would be even more valuable. But if the leader isn't in the place of buying this, at the moment, this isn't a mandate from the centre. It needs to be that pull. So, yeah, we've been quite deliberate on where we've focused, where we know there's going to be pull from the organisation to, yeah, that sounds, I'm happy to go on this journey with you, kind of thing. So that's the stakeholder who would be sat here, who's kind of invisible to Tom, but is important to, or very important to me.
Good. Okay. Well, let's move a little bit further on, if I can get the slides moving. Okay. So, in terms of the approach, I think, you know, this will be familiar to a lot of people in the room. Like that first phase is obviously that for the partner to try and, you know, do a few things. It's trying to prove that we are worthy of being your partner. We're trying to prove that we can understand your business, as we're not necessarily coming from deep energy experience. We're also having to try and prove that the technology, the hardware particularly, works, and that it's fit for purpose. And that is, you know, those are some of the elements that we're looking to, develop during that all-important proof of concept phase. And I think there are certain things during that phase that are not always in the control of the vendor. We don't know at the beginning when we start out that our solution is going to run on your network. We don't know whether people from the instructional design team are really going to buy into changing the way that they work for certain, for many, many years. So I think there is we've found, and it's not just with Shell, obviously, with other companies, that there's a heavy reliance on kind of, the emotional piece. Can we get people to jump forward beyond the kind of the lack of data? And so the feedback tends to be more anecdotal. The data piece, as we've said, comes further down the line. Do you think that's a fair account of where we were in that first phase?
Yeah, this isn't something in Shell. So a lot of engineers, a lot of logical. I don't know if it's left brain or right brain, but the logical bit. Used to reading a report, reading a summary, and saying this is okay. I buy into this. Whereas this, as you said, is much more experiential. And I think having a proof of concept that was relatable to someone in Shell, you just stick a pectin on it, and okay, most people say, okay, well, that's not my business, but it must be somewhere in Shell. So this is kind of the simple thing. But in a room, we saw leaders, operators who have been working for 30, 40 plus years and use their iPhone like this. They were going in the virtual reality environment, and their perception and mindset about how it could be used kind of shifting in the space of 10 minutes. I mean, and I'm sure that may be very familiar for you guys, but that was quite powerful for me to see, both wearing it, but then when they start to see it in a operational environment, something they can relate to, that's been hugely helpful. And then you suddenly get all the ideas flowing from the frontline recipients or users of this around, yeah, well, you're going to do training or you're going to do assessment on this, but how about using it in other areas? So that was a pretty big step for us in terms of getting that buy-in from the front line, who that's where it was going to either fail or succeed. So that was a bit by luck, but a bit by planning. And then on the hardware at the moment, we've actually got VR hardware out offshore on a number of our assets. We haven't loaded any of this stuff onto it yet. It's kind of games, it's stuff you would, fun type things to get people just going in, used to wearing it, used to navigating around. So that's probably the next big hurdle we've got of how do people navigate around the VR environment with the headset, the handheld devices in a way which is effective, because all of the assumptions around effectiveness and cost saving, time saving, assume that people know how to use this stuff and it's intuitive. And I think it is to a point, but we need to recognize where our audience is. So yeah, the experiential part of what do we do in each of these phases, I think is pretty important for that engagement. On the data side, I guess that's probably less important for the frontline users. That's more the kind of office-based staff trying to work out how do we optimize process and how do we use that.
And I think one of the things, I mean, you may not know this, but during that early phase where we were trying to raise awareness within Shell of VR and VR distributed multi-user, I think we probably ended up doing about 45 different live demos, and we were very lucky at one stage where I think we had 2 members of your main board joining from The Hague, and we were linked up elsewhere. And then and I think that's one of the things that we have to accept on the solution side, that there is a good deal of investment in time, a good degree of patience, that in order to get to a point where there's something meaningful, there's the beginnings of a relationship, you've just got to be prepared to keep demoing, and whoever wants to see it, my orders to the team were always, I don't care. If they want to see another demo, we want to run another demo, we have to go and travel, that's what we have to do. And I think that phase of building excitement, building knowledge, we didn't realize it was going to take so long, but I think it was a very valuable part of where we are now moving to, because I think there was that sort of visibility. And of course, you know, it's very high impact. You know, I don't think there was anyone that we stuck in the headset and saw someone else joining from another country that didn't at least have a few thoughts, you know, at a minimum. So,
I mean, that's what I was less aware of on our side, that you guys have already run a couple of marathons just to get to that point of coming in and saying,
I didn't want to keep banging on about it, James.
No,
it wouldn't have been right.
So. No, but it's helpful to know, though.
Yeah. Good. So I think in that sort of proof of concept phase, that stakeholder buy-in is absolutely vital, and it can't just be the direct business that you're dealing with. You've really got to try and, I think, take the IT teams along with you, which is not always that straightforward. You've got to try, if you can, and bring the security folks in and prove that this is not some throwaway solution. It's got a level of robustness because there's potential to collect a lot of data. So that kind of that early phase of getting those and getting to those right people, again, before you're really established as a partner, because you know we had a certain amount of pushback, understandably saying, well, why do you want to speak to them, and why do you want to speak to them? And so that, you know, again, it's another thing that adds to this sort of proof of concept phase, but has proved ultimately extremely valuable to us, I think, and gives us perhaps a bit more credibility.
Yeah, and on that, I'd say that, I mean, I'm not, I mean, so I've worked for Shell for 13 years, so so you kind of say I'm kind of coming from that kind of corporate environment, but most of my friends, family, they work in small startups, and so I get the other side of things from when I'm at home or at the pub or whatever with my friends. So I've always tried to be pretty transparent with Tom and the team around dynamics that have been going on within Shell. You know, people move around all the time. Every 3 years, someone changes a role. So trying to keep Tom apprised of that, because I kind of really bought into this is where we need to go. And again, it's not about work, you know, Immerse and wanting Immerse to do everything as much as you probably like that. It's around having a solution which is scalable across our organization. So I think that transparency from my side was easy to give, and I think it was helpful. Yeah. But you get the more transparent I feel I was with you and giving you kind of access introductions, I feel like that's returned because it helps on the internal stakeholder management side of things, which is just huge in Shell. So that's the proof of concept helped to go with something rather than just an idea. So that was, I kind of add that. It's not on the slide necessarily, but that's been a key thing.
Yeah, look, without this turning into some sort of sickly bromance, you know, I think we've got to this point with a great lot of input from you, because it's very, very difficult for a small company to really navigate into some of these big organizations. From the outside, it's probably the hardest thing. So I think that early trust was very, very important. So I think on that proof of concept phase, and again, I think it helps to do something impactful, not necessarily involving flames, but I think you've got to really capture people's imagination very quickly, and I think those two early proof of concepts that we did actually delivered on that pretty well. I think it's that putting people in a situation where they can see that, okay, this isn't the same as the real thing, but it's certainly more than 50% of it, and definitely more than you could ever do in a classroom or, you know, traditional e-learning.
Yeah, and I mean on the level of detail, I mean you've got the Volvo and the shine and the light and everything. I mean, for a proof of concept, that was helpful because it really showed people the full extent of what you could do. It's a bit like if you're buying a car, very rarely do you drive at the top speed of your car, but sometimes when they're showing it off, it shows how fast it can go. The reality is that, and you'll see, I think we've got a screen grab of it later, the version that we created, people quite quickly in the organization got to the point of saying, well, that's not necessary. And it wasn't from a cost point of view, it was also from a time. We don't need, you know, the reflections to be perfect. We don't need the flames to look exactly like that. We don't need the logo, the flammable sign on the side of the truck there. So that's also from a fidelity point of view. I think it's important to reference that, because I don't think any company on the planet could afford to create all their training to this level of fidelity. No,
and I think it's a point we've always considered, and I think, you know, part of our journey as a company, you know, most of our talented Unity developers and designers have a background in gaming, so they're kind of first instincts are to create something that has, you know, award-winning graphics. And I think, you know, we made those mistakes early on, and then, you know, surprise, surprise, they wouldn't render properly. So I think, you know, for us, you know, the accessibility trumping fidelity, you know, wins every single time. And I think trying to show people that you can deliver something that is really authentic, that is, you know, close to real life, but is going to deliver. And I think that's a, you know, it's definitely a really important point. And so moving out of that proof of concept phase, and then, you know, the conversations are starting to become, you know, a bit more meaningful from a kind of longevity perspective. You know, then we sort of got into the pilot phase, and that's really, you know, you were the business sponsor of the pilot phase in many ways. And so just tell us a bit more about those, how we got to those use cases perhaps. And
yeah, maybe, because we haven't actually spoken about what it is we've developed. So I made reference to it. So we have, for all of our operators, frontline people working in the highest risk locations, effectively you're trying to keep, as I said, hydrocarbon within pipe, and make sure that things run effectively and efficiently. So we have a global standard. It's got all sorts of acronyms, but it's a global standard. Everyone needs to have been trained and assessed that they can do a set of kind of core activities in a safe way. So it's a bit like your driver's license that you have for the road, but much more extensive. And you can't drive the car unless you've got this. That's done in multiple different ways in different locations. And largely, the way we do it in the Gulf of Mexico is your most experienced operator would be the assessor. So they're having to go around. So if it's, I'm there, I'm inexperienced, I'm having to tie up my most experienced operator, who could be actually going out and fixing stuff or doing things, to come and watch me perform a task and write down, you know, James did this right, this wrong, and this is the assessment. So the virtual reality modules break down, and there's 30 plus assessment areas, and this is where people can go in a VR environment and carry out that assessment. There's a level of variation they can take, so they can make some wrong answers. It's not very linear in that sense. So it does require you to know what you're doing. You can't just keep clicking on everything and hoping that it will be right. And that was because we have a bit like a driver's license, there's an expiry date on that. And this is all internal Shell stuff, so this isn't regulated externally by a regulator, but this is a Shell standard that we set. So every 3 to 5 years, you need to retake that. And we had last year a big bow wave of people who took it 3 years ago, so obviously a lot of people need to go through that. And that was one of the other hooks we used with the business. Say, look, we can deliver some of this assessment for you without tying up your most experienced people. So yeah, so that's where we are. Some of the modules we built initially didn't have the automated assessment built into them, which would kind of give you don't need anyone, it just tells you an answer whether you followed it correctly. Some of them didn't, because we just wanted to get some of that content out there. And that's where we are at the moment. So I'd say the offshore guys are going through using the hardware, getting comfortable with that. And then from kind of Q2 onwards, we're going to start to actually perform some assessments offshore. I've also referenced Robert Training Center, which is where my team, who do a lot of this stuff, so they're the ones who take the credit, where we deliver training. We can then tag on this virtual reality assessment at the end of it. So you don't just do all your driving lessons, you then have your test at the end of it, and you may pass or fail. And then that may result in go back and do the training again, or whatever it may be. But so we're starting to use this. Still early, because a lot of the stuff we need to do is still manual. It's still kind of physical classroom-based training or e-learning. So I think until we have a tipping point of whatever that is, the majority of our training being delivered in a virtual environment, we're still not going to fully be able to get away from having people coming to physical training locations or having to put themselves in harm's way. As I said, with this underwater, the Hewitt underwater egress training, where they tip you upside down and put you in a pool. Some of those things will just be unavoidable. You're going to have to put people in that physical environment. But that's where we are now. I think for me, we're at the start of the pilot phase. It's around this year. I think Shane was here from DTS, said that he was told by our organisation we've got 180 use case projects in a funnel this year, whereas last year it was probably 10 to 12. meaningful ones once you weed out the duplication. So our organization is now much more cued into this is a viable option. Yeah, I hope to see it grow and as I said, scale up in an integrated manner.
And I think also, even though there was a massive amount of thought that went into the way that the 5 assessments were designed, lots of sort of backwards and forwards in terms of, with your heavy subject matter expertise from your team, and then kind of expertise on the product and the technical side from my team. When we started to do the very first testing, there was a lot of stuff that needed changing, and I think this is a point, an important point that, and it does require an element of patience on your side, that this is so new. We're still right at the beginning, and we've got to be ready to iterate and keep optimizing. But I think we've traveled quite a long distance, in the couple of years that we've been working together, for sure. Yeah. Just slightly conscious of time, and if there's going to be any questions. So we can talk about some of these things in more detail if you're interested, and to come by the stand. So I think perhaps just sort of in closing, maybe some of the anything further to say on some of the organizational challenges that you face. You've touched on some of those points.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the partnership comes in, because I mean there are technical challenges which have an organizational impact, like choice of hardware. So what Shell chooses to be the VR hardware of choice, we then need to adapt to that. Yeah. And that's obviously there's a technical element to that around what do we think is best from an organization point of view. But all that internal dynamic of the different silos and different parts of our organization. I mean, our IT organization has about 3 or 4 different areas in it that I'm aware of, whether that's business facing, project facing, to do with infrastructure, to do with software, to do with other areas. You've then got, as I said, the risk, IRM, our information risk management organization, that anything cloud-based, software, computer-based that we're going to be doing, there's a whole host of challenges you need to go through there. And I think what I've experienced here with looking for a VR solution is it kind of cuts across a whole bunch of different people. And some of them it's really easy. You have a conversation, they're like, great, I'm glad people are thinking about this. How can I help? Whereas other people, they've got their day jobs, and this is maybe notionally 10, 20% of what they should be doing, which basically means they're not doing anything on it. So it's much more of a sell. So internally, that's the challenge I've been facing, is trying to align the Shell organization behind what we're trying to deliver, but also leverage their expertise, because there's normally good reason why we can't do certain things, or we have other protocol in place. And that shows up in the project. And that's why I said it, by being quite transparent with Tom on what's been going on, it's meant that some of those back channels, he's been able to have conversations, or I've been able to bring him along with me there. So I think I wouldn't underestimate that. And that's just to get things up and running. There's then all the behavioral change that we want to have off the back of this. So to do training and assurance in this way, we need to get regulators to agree that, yeah, if you've done a virtual assessment, that's okay. We see that's valid. We need to get the person standing the other side of a valve that's just about to be opened, or in a line of fire, to trust that the person who's had a virtual training and a virtual assessment knows how to do that, versus getting an experienced person who's done it hands-on, they've seen it in the real world. So I think that's still to come for us, and there'll be some of the challenges that we'll face, and the technology will keep evolving. So that's kind of less controllable from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hardware point is an important one, because I think when we first started 2 years ago, we were working with the HTC Vive. Thinking is evolving all the time. I think everyone is looking at, certainly for this type of training, this type of assessment, which is pretty scalable. We're looking to certainly deploy it at scale. You've got to think about your choice of hardware, and I don't think that the Vive is necessarily the right type of hardware for this when it gets deployed in anger across the business. So that's a kind of evolving piece, even though our platform is device agnostic, there is still a certain amount, particularly in terms of the user experience, that has a big impact when we choose what hardware, when you choose what hardware, and then we have to sort of adapt to that.
Yeah.
And then I think, there is this sort of, clearly, as we're getting into the interesting bit in terms of the data, really wanting to track efficacy and, how we can influence performance and lower risk, and what data do you need to capture from the experience? How does that get fed back into your LMS? How do people access from Shell jumping into our solution? I mean, these are the points that, my team spend a lot of time on, and my IT team is a little bit smaller than yours.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But these are kind of very, very key points. So, are you anything else you want to say in closing? Or I think we're.
No, other than, I hope it was of some help and interest. I'm more than happy to talk afterwards if it's helpful, or separately to this, outside of the event in the next couple of days. And keen to learn from some of the things that I've maybe raised that you've experienced and have a solution, or have have encountered and have overcome. So again, definitely not professing to have the answers and all the how this will work. So yeah, keen to continue that transparency of sharing where we're struggling, and hopefully hear from you guys either later today or in the coming weeks on where you see improvement areas for us.
Great. Thank you, James, for speaking and sharing your knowledge in a very
for the opportunity.
Open way. So I think it's much appreciated.
Good.
Yeah. Real quick, I just wanted to do like maybe 2 questions. Is that okay? We have a lot,
yeah.
And as we discussed, they'll be available at the Immerse booth during the lunch break, which is long, and we'll have an opportunity for you to ask individual questions. But we had a couple that were voted up. Yesterday in one of the sessions, we heard visual accuracy or realism is not necessarily a key to learning. What is your feedback from your users and experience? So visual accuracy.
So I agree with the statement. I think the key thing from a learning environment is that objects react and behave as they would in the real world. So we had an example of an engineering design. They put it through, so it was actually Kinetic Magic. They put it into a VR environment for us. But everything was, I think it was like 3 different colors. The pipes, everything was yellow, and it didn't look very real. But then when you started to make things interactable, and it felt like there was a level of gravity, or when you pick it up, it was that level of realism that people found more useful, as opposed to, and it wasn't, I don't think anyone in here, we had a separate VR tool built, and it was at an airport, and the puddles had the reflection of the clouds in them and everything like this, but it didn't feel as real, and people said, no, I preferred the thing which I clearly know is fake, but my brain kind of makes up and adds in all the detail because it's reacting and behaving like it would in the real world if I was to try and pick this chair and throw it, rather than me, having the stitching on the chair, but it doesn't really feel like it's throwing. So that's the experience anecdotally that we picked up from, well, almost consistently from anyone who we interacted with.
Okay, thank you. And then a little bit more, I'd say technical, without, some of these are a lot more technical. Are you using a cloud solution or on-premise with internet access? And if in the second case, how will you scale for more people?
So the Immerse solution is cloud-based. It's on AWS. I don't think that's proved to be a problem for Shell at all. I mean, I think we had those discussions early on, and we advised that we could have developed on-prem, but I think on the whole, the vast majority of the clients that we deal with are very comfortable with a cloud-based solution. That would be my view.
I think the only thing I would add is we have had experience of cloud-based solutions that, because of the Shell firewalls, and again, I don't profess to understand all the details, but it basically slows that increases the lag between someone operating it in a location, going to the cloud and back again. So when you're trying to move around, it can get a bit jerky. So that's a Shell thing we need to fix, but again, maybe worth considering when you're going into big companies like Shell with all this firewall, or maybe locations which don't have that real-time connectivity. That could be an issue. But again, I don't have an answer, but that's just what I'm aware of we've had in Shell.